And hello, welcome back, everybody. Just going to wait for Michael and Ryan to come back in here. That was a powerful first hour, I must say. And it's great to see Ryan has so many points that are they mix very well with what Michael and I are trying to do here with this podcast. And that's just incredible stuff. I found he was talking about Carlos Castaneda. I found a really good quote from him where he's talking about self esteem. I don't know if you've ever heard this one, Michael, where he says, "The self confidence of the warrior is not the self confidence of the average man. The average man seeks certainty in the eyes of the onlooker and calls that self confidence. The warrior seeks impeccability in his own eyes and calls that humility. The average man is hooked to his fellow men, while the warrior is hooked only to infinity." And when we did shows on Ayn Rand and Nathaniel Branden, we're going to be doing more on that. But this idea of self esteem and what it is to go on the Siddhartha path, it sort of takes that spine of a warrior to go through all those challenges that you're going to face, which is where I think Ryan was getting into. There's these stages that you go through. I don't know, had you ever heard of that, Michael, and what's your comment on it?
No, but it makes perfect sense to me. I mean, we are living in we're moving into a post-introspective world. So the Hermetic Arts, to me, in whatever form they are, like applied is the most important. So martial arts, I've said it a million times, it's the most applied. And that, because a lot of people, see, I've met most of the people that I've met who are into these subjects, they fly around the room. They're purely into it speculatively and intellectually. How important it is, even if it's just, the physicalization. And remember, we had another podcast where we even talked about that thought follows action. So there's a whole conversation to be had there that
Right.
until you've made it action, whether in artisanship, or, something like the Qigong and the Aikido, it's just talk. It's just a lot of hot air. This is the danger there. But remember too, that my focus is always the fact that if man was left alone, if there was no impediment, because we've even talked about, the consciousness of the ordinary common person and how difficult it is to awaken them from this negredo. But see, I believe that, my whole focus in life is that if we didn't have an unseen hand of control, man would naturally fly, not just towards art and, other more charity and all that, and nature, like we started off talking about in the beginning, but even to the higher mystical aspects. You would naturally fly upon this out, an architect's control of it. So then we need to know the anatomy of that controlling force. And they use solar power. We touched on that. But they, but just say that person has been listening to up to a certain point. They go, look, I accept there's an architecture of control, or at least the orthodoxy is just riddled with lies. Take me to the next step. What is the next step? The next step is, which follows on from the first, is simply to show them that there is a cap imposed upon you subliminally onto your level of development. So it's like you throw a stone into a water and the ripples go, but then there's something hindering the expansiveness of that. You go so far. How does that happen? Well, look at religion. They've made Jesus, and you can't get any higher than Jesus. Has anybody ever thought of that's conspiratorial, that has an effect on your mind, that if there's a guru or a solar king at the extreme apogee, or whatever you want to call it, this supreme zenith, then that's it, mate. You're under that. So already you've been suppressed and you haven't noticed it. That's the power of the solar light. In the divine right of kings, the royalty is gone. We're going to dream up that it was quite late, actually, like late. They dreamt up the divine right of kings. It wasn't even in royalty before. They dreamt that up because this is the inflation I'm talking about. Because if I can divine right myself, if I'm directly from God, then hey, punk, you're not, I don't care who you are. You could be a minister, a cardinal, you're below me, right? So there we have that, capping the development of people. Scientism. What is that if not a cap? When they say, there's only one way to look at the world. Me, Steven Pinker, I know what it's all about. My atheism tells you I'm a fucking infantile level of development, but you're not meant to know that. No, I am a scientist, right? So science now has capped you, because now intuition doesn't come to bear, gut feeling doesn't come to bear, a right brain, synthetic, fuck that. Yeah? Of course, luckily we have the Buckminster Fuller's determinism that cap you. Now, granted, we've got Keith Critchlow and we've got, the great Bruce Lipton's and even the Buckminster Fullers. every one of the schools I've just told, we got nixers, right? We're going to say, nah, and they're going to free you. Like Manly Palmer Hall's going to free you from that idea that Jesus is the top or scientism is the only way. You know, we've got the dissenters, but I want people to know this consciously when they enter into a subject. Otherwise, you don't get past the first grade of Negredo. Your ascent to the Superman, which is not something, as Ryan well pointed out, it's not something arrogant. Moral superiority has nothing to do with arrogance, right? Because if you're on that spiritual path, you ain't going to get anywhere unless you have that statement of higher value. Here's another important thing: you better be arrogant to a point of view, morally, not over people. See, the government systems that I've mentioned, and we've said this till it blew in the face, they are not high. They only got a semblance of highness because they are brilliant at suppressing everybody else down to the sewer level.
Right.
But they're not high themselves. They're psychopaths. The real highness, that's too heady. It's like what Ryan is talking about. If you really felt the magus, if you were on the edge of the cliff like the fool or the magus, that's pretty vertical. It's like vertigo. So one of the stages, you were talking about the stage of courage and the stage of power. The power is what I'm talking. That's what I'm addressing. The power isn't power over anyone. It's a empowerment in yourself that's very much connected to breath. That's very much connected to freedom. But it's the power of having the intellectual awareness to see through the three caps, so that you can progress further than Jesus. He said it himself: "What I can do, you can do also and more." You can go and have an intelligence that's more whole brain than scientism, including what the scientists have discovered, but something more. You can suppress beyond the divine right of some authority figure who sets himself up. All of these things are surpassable. Leonardo da Vinci, Michelangelo, they've all said it, that the greatest student is the one who surpasses the teacher, right? There's a grand humility in that, right? What we have is the humility to crawl on fours to the authority, but we have none of the moral superiority. Even the use of that word in a Randian sense, and I'm using it in that sense, is it gets people into a sweat because they don't understand it. And they don't understand also that there is a stepping away from the collective is absolutely part and parcel of this thing. So, and that's mythic. They showed it in Lord of the Rings. Probably the greatest, in many ways, arguably one of the greatest scenes in that book, and in the film, is when they are leaving the Shire, and suddenly, I think it's Frodo, stops. It may be Sam, and he says, one more step, and I will have left the familiar. I'll never have gone this far. What a fucking scene.
Yeah.
And every single person listening to us who even thinks that they're going to be on a mystical path is going to go through that. And yeah, you have to make that step. Of course, that was physicalized. They really mean intellectual. And another point I'll just finish this opening statement on is, we're talking a lot about suffering and Negredo and underworld journey. Don't somebody think that that's the soul sign of the religion. We're talking Dasein and existential, right? Crossing the lineman like Frodo had to do. Don't ever mistake that this is the same thing as the priests impose upon you when it's get on your knees and crawl and suffer. Believe in God and suffer for the rest of your life, which is like in India and the rest of it, all cultures that insist that you got to believe in the authority, put your belief in us, but suffer for the rest of your life in pure ignorance. That's totally not the kind of suffering we're advocating here, obviously, right? And also, I forgot one anecdote, and that is that when we're talking about a priest class, a female Illuminati, they've already gone through, they morph as the generations, we can't go into this in any detail, but I was thinking here loosely in my female Illuminati thesis, when these celebs are out there making these yoni symbols, they are, these airheads, right? They are telling you they're the new priest class. So when I describe the priests as being the traditional ones in robes and all, yeah, but the eternal symbol of the priesthood is the yoni. Remember, I told you they're solar. They're lunar, and they're feminine. If you understand the symbolism that they're using, but when you see the celebs, you're using that yoni as they do many times. Can't remember the airheads' names. Something you want to forget. But anyway, the fact that they're using it says, "Hey, bugger," and all the other symbols that they're using, all the other symbols, they're saying, you think they're still of the church, the priest class? No, it's us. It's Lady Gaga. It's all of these people. And even the names, as I say, the symbolism. We don't want to go into the whole thing. But there's a new priest class in town using the same old ancient symbols. And they're working on you. And they're capping that. They're capping you creatively. If our studio homogenized mud, level of music, the sludge culture music, we're capping you. So if anybody's doing anything below that, fuck you. We don't want to listen to it, right? You're going to the world is going to be listening to and digesting this utter crap. And in many other ways, just their mere cult of celebrity to cap it, so that upcoming people, musicians and upcoming talents, have no chance of getting through. So just bear that in mind as well. But it's very, very serious, this suppression by way of light and by way of solar symbols. They undermine your self-esteem and make it seem that if you are a person who's morally superior, you can't speak it, you can't say it, you can't walk it. And that's why people have to get into Ayn Rand and Nathaniel Branden, because you're never going to pass to the next grade unless there's a healthy sense of egocentricity, not egotism, which is screaming about something you're not, but egocentricity, where, like you say, you've earned the stripes. You can look the world in the eye and say, I have achieved this. I feel good about this. I give myself, the green mark of accomplishment and success.
Yeah, and just before I get your comment there, Ryan, I want to kind of set the stage with another quote here from Manly Palmer Hall that's talking a bit about what Michael was pointing out, where he was saying Pythagoras was said to have been the first man to call himself a philosopher. In fact, the world is indebted to him for the word philosopher. Before that time, the wise men had called themselves sages, which was interpreted to mean those who know. Pythagoras was more modest. He coined the word philosopher, which he defined as one who is attempting to find out. Oh, that is a very, very powerful quote. Ryan, what do you think about that?
I've never heard that quote, but I like it. It's interesting. I definitely am a Pythagorean, and especially when it comes to math and form. And well, let me point this out real quick. It's based on my etymology. Pythagoras is really Pythagoras, right? Pythagoras would be a Greek rendition of Pythagoras, which is Ptah in Egypt would be father, and Horus is the son, father, son, right? The connection between paternal, meaning pattern, right? That's where we get the word pattern. So paternal is just the patterns we see in form or in nature. So Pythagoras, so brilliantly in his works and what I've read of him, he actually does map form. And that's what our whole modern science is based on. And I think it's interesting that he humbles himself and says someone who's attempting, instead of maybe arrogantly saying, hey, I know, right? And I think this is the problem with science in general in the Western world. Speaking of what Michael was talking about, I have a different, I have a way of thinking that I really try to think holistically. And so I try to syncretize everything, because I think that nature does that. Nature is a whole. So I will link something like etymology to history, and then I'll link history to mythology, and then I'll link mythology to architecture, right? And most people go, what? Like, what you're out to lunch, right? And I go, no, I'm not out to lunch. This is the way we used to do it. This is the way Pythagoras was able to see the interconnectivity or the interconnections of the world, of nature. And so I'll go back to what I think the problem with science is right now is, well, I'll use the word to try to display this. The word science, the root etymology is SCI, right? Science, SCI. And the ENCE refers to like essence or something referring to consciousness or knowing, right? Sia and SCIA means to know. And so SCI is the root we get for split, right? Scission, like scissors. SCI means to split. And so decision is how you split reality and go, I'm going this way. Or incision is how you split reality and go, I'm going this way. So the interesting thing about science itself is that it has, how do I say this? Michael spoke about this, like the limitations are built within the method itself. So even though solar light shines its light on everything, it also has a limitation, meaning it can blind you. And I actually learned that from you, where I was like, oh yeah, the sun, I don't get to see anything unless the sun shines upon it and reveals it. But also, if I look at the source, that's revealing all these things, if I look directly at the sun, I'm blinded. So the limitation is built within the technique or the method itself. And we all struggle with this on a consciousness level and a spiritual level. We stand in our own way, right? And so I love science because I'm analytical and intellectual. However, if you really look into the splitting of what science is doing, science is basically taking something that has no limits, meaning infinity. The universe itself, in my view, is limitless, and it's putting limits on it and saying, just look at what's in the box. Just disregard everything else, right? This is the problem with the Big Bang. It's a joke. It's like, well, if everything blew out of this tiny little spark, well, what's all the stuff around the spark before it blew, right? Like, what's all that space? You're not taking that into account. So science is constantly doing this. And so I'm definitely a Russellian. And this is probably the hardest concept for me to talk to people about. One, it is very difficult to understand. Two, very difficult to articulate. And three, most people born in the West do not have their right brain opened enough to see things interconnected in an interconnected way or a holistic way. And Walter Russell, his science, there's others too. I mean, Pythagoras is this way, and so is Da Vinci, and so is, I'm a big fan of Goethe. They all were looking at the universe as a whole. And so when you read their science versus what we call science today, modern like quantum physics, or you read Walter Russell, you'll see, if you get it, if you're able to look and go, oh, I know what he's saying, you see everything as a whole. The whole thing, we're basically trying to map infinity. And the only way to map something infinite is to put limits on it and go, okay, there's a pattern. We're going to focus in on this pattern, and then we're going to see, and then we're going to expand that, and we're going to realize, oh, that same fractal pattern, when you expand it, is still there, only bigger or smaller, depending on which way you go. And then you're going to do it again and expand it again, right? And then you say, oh, that same pattern is still there. That father-son, that pattern, right, paternal, that same mapping of form is still there. And then you just keep going bigger and bigger and bigger and bigger and bigger. You go, oh, it's still there. And then you keep going smaller and smaller and smaller and smaller. Oh, it's still there. There's only one conclusion that you can draw from that if you're actually doing science using the scientific method is it's all one. It's all one, right? And I don't mean one. So I'll go back to Schwaller de Lubbock's. He has two different terms in his mapping of numerical literacy. There's one, as in the archetype of wholeness or oneness. And then there's sort of this other version, which is the only way we can map it or talk about it or put it into form or language, which is one as the reducible one. And it's a very, very tricky, well, it's not tricky, it's just maybe hard for me to explain. But in mathematical terms or Pythagorean terms, if you're doing math and your math doesn't create or map a form, and actually I should say a balanced form, then you're technically not doing math. And this is the problem with sort of special relativity and certain theories in quantum mechanics is they're plotting all these dots. And then the whole idea is, okay, now we've plotted these dots and now we have to connect them with lines. And then let's look at the form they make. Well, if you look at modern quantum physics, they don't make a form. They're just dots that don't ever interconnect. And if you were to sort of connect the first one with the last one, they don't make any sort of geometric shape. It's sort of this ambiguous shape, right? And so that's not math. That's not Pythagorean, and that's not Hermetic, and that's not Russellian. And so when you really dig deep into science, right, numbers, it's actually very esoteric. And you try to tell a scientist this, and they're gone. Like they just don't get it, right? Yeah. And my uncle is actually a very high ranking plasma physicist, and we go back and forth, right, about this. And he thinks I'm out to lunch, and I think he's sort of blindsided. But he is willing to admit, even with his math, that the same patterns that regulate, phyllotaxis regulate the development of an embryo, and that also those same patterns regulate what appears to be our solar system and the movement of the stars. And I go, well, as above, so below, right? So So what I'm trying to get, if I could sum this up, is that our mathematicians have lost, our scientists have lost sight of our great ancestral wisdom, which you could say Hermeticism is actually a science, right? The 7 Hermetic principles have never been disproven. Therefore, the scientific method applies to them. It is a very fundamental way of mapping reality or form. So, yeah, so there we go.
Oh, that's excellent.
See,
well, go ahead.
I was thinking that. Go ahead, David.
No. You go right ahead. I'll come in after.
There was one topic. You mentioned symbolism. See, in the banner I made, I put the dragons there and stuff. I was all conscious because, again, the symbols of the zodiac, like you're saying, the symbols of precession, the symbols of a telestic, or the Greeks call it entelechy, which there is, or teleology would be the philosophical thing I'm looking for, which is children don't start as adults and become infants, right? Wise men, you don't start wise and get dumb, right? There's a certain trajectory of all advancement, which is, to use a very inadequate word, progress. But in narrow philosophical terms, you do have this pattern. Start from the Negredo and you move up to the Albedo. So it seems that very few people have addressed this, right? This simple flow, this certain unfolding. And even if they admit it in math or in science, right, where you start from 0 and then you move up through the numbers, right? Complex systems are arising out of less complex systems, although by weird paradox, as people like Ken will point out, the advanced, more complex systems must be implicit within what we call the lesser, right? This is bizarre, right? Especially when you're dealing with holons and fractals, in which many of our favorite people have done, like Bruce Lipton. But it's simple observation of these scientists who are resistant to this must understand that if you can say there's, like we dealt with Frank Joseph, abiogenesis, and Michael Cremo, what, like you say, the Big Bang, what caused the first spark? How did that even erupt into something that must have been there? There must have been a something there. How did the first the first algae on Earth? All of these primal questions. Everything, they admit one fundamental fact. Even the deepest atheist who's stuck and fixed must understand that complex systems arise from less complex. But the next step to take those people is that must it not be holographic, in the sense that in potentia, that which was simple contained the greater. So that even in time, when the greater evolved, like the best one example would be human consciousness, right? How did all the material evolution through whales all the way back to amoeba and moths and whatever else they want to point to, how did that relate? How did that arise? How did that result in human consciousness? They're stumm, or although they chase tails a lot to make you think they're actually addressing this question, as I keep saying, they just explain it away. When you get back to the actual subject, you realize, okay, wait a minute, there's an active kinetic movement from this place to that. That's not even being addressed. Even if you describe the evolution from smaller, less complex to more complex, you're not really addressing what is the kinetic force that is evolving or making that progress. And you're not admitting to yourself that it must be consciousness, since consciousness is the result of it that then asks the question about it, like I can possibly do right now, and I'm doing. Then consciousness must be not just the fulfillment of the entire process teleologically, it is the process. It takes a Hegel and Schelling to bring this out, and then we don't teach those guys in school. So and one other point is that the word diabolos, you're talking about scission. Diabolos, the very root of the word devil, means to divide. So the devil is in the details, in the sense that there is something demonic about the idea that you have to polarize yourself into subject and object in order to come back full circle, there and back again. As Tolkien would have said, you have to have a goal. You've got to walk the road between. It's a devilish thing. You're going to get scarred and rent to pieces, and you'll be an inner contradiction. So why people don't get onto this road, why they don't go further than Negredo, and even you got to drag them to past that point of Negredo, is because they know of the incredible suffering that's going to take to introspect. It's a tremendous thing. So then the individual resists it, then they create a cult of atheistic materialistic science, which a child who's done 5 minutes of homework can see through. It's bogus, but it doesn't matter. We need it, because how can I stay within the confines of the five senses world? I don't just need to advocate it myself. I need a cult, a sect of scientists who are going to, advocate that, just in the same way as I need a bunch of democratic politicians who talk about we're equal. See, capped. There's another way of capping you from progressing towards your uniqueness by saying everybody's equal, mate. Equality is the world. No, it isn't. Morally speaking, people are not equal. Spiritually speaking, they're not equal. But then you have a Julius Evola who'll teach you that. Does anybody teach Julius Evola then in the schools? No, never forgot. Turn the page there, you see. So all the sages, you talked about the Pythagoras quote where a philosopher was originally called a sage. That word is incredible just to study that alone. I know I'm jumping around here, but that word is the root of Anglo-Saxon. A Saxon, a Saka, was the Scythians, who were called the world sages. They went all over the world and taught everybody else everything. So there's even we're talking priest classes. These existed. They existed in the West. They existed in the West. That's the Arya, the Saka, the sages. I mean, it's unbelievable. The whole groups of people were so into the cosmos, so into astrology, so into the plant life. Like you said, nature, going to nature. These men taught the way of nature, because when thinking goes wrong, you bring it back to the basic matrix of the mathematics of nature. And nature being neter in the Egyptian, meaning the gods. So, Earth and cosmos meet.
Yeah, I mean, the Earth and cosmos meeting is, that interconnectivity again. And, what you're talking about, self-reflecting, right? How are we supposed to know anything if we're not split? How we have to see our own thoughts, right? And then ping back and forth between them. There's a split right there. And then that sort of goes back onto back to those patterns is like, I think you said this before, David, is like, how does a seed already know its full expression as a tree?
Right.
It's there. It's already there. This is something that science will never be able to replicate, no matter how much they try. They want to clone human beings, or they want to put chips in you, or they want to control your consciousness or control your chemistry. It's all very nefarious type of stuff. What blows my mind is that people sign up for it. They're just like retarded. But science is never going to be able to map the spirit, right? Because it's not mappable. It's infinite. It has no form, right? I think one of the best way that I learned this was Giordano Bruno. He basically said that all bodies dissolve. And I was like, oh yeah, of course they do. How come I never figured this out on my own? It's just like, take anything, any form, any body, and just watch it long enough, and it will disintegrate. It will just turn to dust, and then who knows where it goes from there. It becomes energy, right? It's like, so what is the purpose of a body? It's to inform. It's to become and embody a certain consciousnness and express it in form. And then it's designed to go back to its source. And science will never be able to control that, never be able to own and patent that. It's just not possible, right? And so this is where science falls short. It's where the intellect falls short, right? There's something beyond intellect. There's something possibly even beyond reason. And sort of jumping around again, back to what Michael was saying, I got to give you, I wanted to say this before I forget. I never would have read Ayn Rand, or I knew she was, and I watched like tiny bits of the Fountainhead when I was a kid. Of course, didn't understand it then. But I just got to thank you guys. There's a lot of people I got to thank you for. Nathaniel Brandon, never would have heard of him. Schwaller de Lubix, I believe I found them before I found you guys, but he's really influential to me. And Rand, and there's others too. But I'm currently listening to the audiobook of Philosophy, Who Needs It, right? That's directly because I listen to you guys, and I'm just like, wow, there's a philosopher in modern times who is not speaking in flowery, undecipherable, whimsical prose. It's like, it's a very long book, no doubt, and very dense, but it's crystal clear. It's just like, her language is direct. It's, exactly what she's saying.
She could have called it "Grow the Fuck Up" by Ayn Rand.
Yeah. It's actually, and she's a woman too. So give, there's not that many female philosophers out there. So I like to say, hey, you know, this is not a male female thing. It's very powerful stuff, and what I get most out of it, and I'm not through it yet, is the rights of the individual and the sovereignty of the individual versus the collective. You know, for me, it's about this collectivism and its detriment to society, right? Now, that being said, we are all social beings, right? So we have to participate. Well, we don't have to, but we're inclined to participate socially. I wouldn't say negate that.
No.
But we have to understand that Ayn Rand is correct with all the change that's going to happen in your life is not going to be given to you by the herd. It's going to be given to you by yourself as an individual.
Right. And actually, it's so funny because I was just having this discussion with somebody when we got into the issue of free speech and whether or not people should be allowed to own firearms and whether or not we should continue building a society centered around the individual. And it ended up being somewhat of a debate because the person I was speaking to, it was after we had a couple beers and they just started coming up and they started talking about Trump and everything. And I live in Canada, so the minute Trump comes up, like everybody gets their hackles up. So I actually steered the conversation away from Trump and started to go into the concept of values as an individual and where our rights come from. And I started discussing a little bit about Ayn Rand. I don't know what I was thinking, that somehow talking about Ayn Rand would be better in front of these people than talking about Trump because they'll react the same way. But regardless, I was thinking, okay, how do I explain this without having people get torn apart by the way they view what you're talking about? And you just say, okay, conceptually, everything we've said in this show is about your journey as an individual, and it's about your selfhood, okay? And we all know instinctively that if we don't take care of our bodies, okay, just on a basic level, you don't take care of your body, you won't be equipped to raise children, to earn money, to go out and make anything, to perfect yourself through some kind of skill or discipline. You won't, just that alone, okay? What Ayn Rand is saying, yeah, it doesn't stop there, motherfucker. It goes into your consciousness and your mind. You have to understand that your consciousness is yours. It does not belong to the state. It does not belong to the family around you. It does not belong to the herd of people around you. It's yours, and you have to create it. It's not this thing that, oh, I'm a human being, so I was automatically born with this soul and this consciousness and this perception. It's something you create in life. That is a totally different way of looking at things, and that's what I got out of Ayn Rand's work. And I owe Michael a debt of gratitude for that because he brought both those, Brandon and Ayn Rand, into my life as well. And I read it, and I was like, well, she's saying what Pythagoras is saying and what Morihei Ueshiba is saying, what Bruce Lee's saying, just in a different way. And she's taking on the hierarchy that says, no, you are who you are because of everybody else. That's the talismanic message, is you are who you are because of everyone. And she's like, no. And that's not the truth. That's not the truth. If you think about it, you're born alone and you're going to die alone. Just two conceptual ideas, right? And people go, oh, that's scary. And that's why that fear of that statement, that fear of that knowing that that's what life is, the life and death cycle, scares people so much that they want to they're willing to go into this sort of circus of saying, well, no, I guess I am who I am because of everyone. And what she's trying to do is bring you back and say, no, hold on. First of all, the best civilization ever built in history that brought about the most freedom we've ever seen as a society came from a structure that was centered first around supporting the individual and then the collective. So she's never said, don't have friends, don't be a part of any society. She's talking philosophically of this is what it takes to make sure you're free in that society, because otherwise, this is where Gustave Le Bon comes in. You have these communisms and these socialisms and these things that are saying you don't own the product of your mind. The herd owns it. The state owns it. We control it. You don't control it. That is always and forever going to be a tyranny. Always. Because it's like she said, the greatest minority, everybody's talking about minorities and who's been oppressed and who's got privilege and who doesn't. The greatest minority on earth is the individual.
Yeah.
Stick that in your pipe and just think about it. And I didn't go into this explanation, but what I did say in this conversation was, well, you go and work hard. You work for your money. You put a lot of time, energy, and money into getting your skills so that you can go out and provide for your family, and hopefully you're doing something you love, right? What if you go and you work that 60-hour work week, and the government comes in and says, all right, I want 80% of your pay because you're the product of your mind. It might even be 100% if it goes full on. Your product of your mind isn't yours. it belongs to everybody else. So we are the power that's going to take your life creation and we're going to disseminate it amongst people who didn't even know who you were, let alone contribute to that creation. And that's the tyranny. And when I explain it like that, this person who they literally couldn't speak it. They were like, they had to like walk away. And they came over after and they're like, I never thought of it like that. Where did you get this stuff? And I'm like, Unslaved Podcast, check it out.
Yeah. You know, that's why I just think you guys are doing incredible work. Like I said earlier, there's not that many people out there. There's a million people out there putting content on the web, but there's very few people putting what I consider to be conscious content, right? Content that's going to help you, right? You don't have to agree with any of this, but I think that everyone should be exposed to it and like just sit with themselves, make up their own mind, and think about it, right? And
but that's the process. That's the process. Only the individual can take, right? You can't do it for me, and I can't do it for you, right?
Yeah, it's funny. I mean, I have these conversations with my family. I brought up Ayn Rand recently to I won't say who in my family, and this person was just like, "Oh my God, I can't believe that you support that." And I'm like, "Do you know her? Do you know her work?" And they're like, "No."
Never read it.
I was like, "Have you?" I was like, "Well, what do you know?" And like, I don't know. I was like, "Well, maybe you saw the movie The Fountainhead, right? You know, it's a pretty classic movie." And I didn't realize like she is so influential. Like her, I'm not sure which book. Maybe it's The Fountainhead. It's one of the most influential books of this century, or last.
Atlas Shrugged, yeah.
Yeah, Atlas Shrugged, yeah. And it's like, why don't people know who she is, right? And so, long story short, I was like, okay, so you never watched the movie, you've never listened to her speak. I was like, have you ever read anything that she's ever written? One word? Nope. And I'm like, well, then you can't talk right now. You might as well just say, I don't know. And that's better. Saying I don't know is honest, right? It's authentic. Like, I don't know. That's a way better place to stand on.
Isn't that arrogance? We were talking about the arrogance of the spiritual man. Shit, you want to find arrogance, there it is. So the people who critique the man who's going on a separate journey of individual development, the introspective, contemplate, how dare they? It's within their coterie that you find. There's a perfect example of what you just said. You know, these people, and of course we've all encountered them, right? They're the ones brimming over with fucking arrogance, unworked, unworthy of it. And like I said, remember the Negredo was pointing out, sticking their heads in it. Don't talk about higher things. Point out that all the structures that they've taught them, that's going to teach their children, the food they're eating, the mercury that's in their mouths, interfering with their freaking brains, right? The clothes they're wearing, you know, the whole 9 yards. And then you know, this is the job, I think, if you try to get too abstract, it's not going to work. You're being self-defeating. You've got to show how the world that they are used to, that they're sucking on the tit of, is so corrupt and corroded and vile. And at that point, you're going to immediately be splitting people down the middle of those who say, you know, I like it and I'm never going to listen to you. Or the people who suddenly, you know, are listening to you, which of course we wouldn't be here if they weren't. We know that thousands of people are listening, you know, through the years. I know that they've been listening and they have been getting it and they have been sticking close to the truth.
Yeah.
And they're able to get used to actually this deconstructive thought, which I think is wonderful, you know, and then you can lead them to bigger things hermetically, you know, and I want to, before we finish, you know, get maybe into one or two themes, you know, like Gnosticism, get your opinion on that, a few of the themes of Hermeticism leading up to selfhood. But selfhood begins, we're just talking about its beginning right now, where it begins by you critically examining the Big Bang Theory, you know, various scientific ideas about the origin of the species and the origin of consciousness. Those are very healthy things. And there's greater books now than there's ever been before. It touches on the theme we were talking about in the first hour about, is it, you know, are we anywhere? You know, well, yes, there's a lot of, I have to admit also that there is incredible new light in contemporary language. You touched on this yourself, that it's okay reading something that's in some Shakespearean language. Not everybody's going to be able to read those 600-page volume, you know, tomes. Now you can do it in 100 pages, less. You know, there's videos, there's a lot of very, very good modern interpretations of some very esoteric things. You know, my whole life has been also dedicated to taking abstract ideas and making them as palatable as they can for the ordinary person. And of course, that has shown success and so on. So one can't be pessimistic. There's no way that can happen. But again, I just want to make that point. Anyone, what Rand's work brings out for me, you know, and by the way, next week I'll be doing a whole podcast on great women. Of course, Ayn Rand will be absolutely number one on that list. So I invite members and non-members to tune into that. But the thing that she brings out for me is that don't fear being arrogant to that degree if it's based on a true statement of higher value, and it can be morally. Then yes, you do stand apart. You're not going with the herd. You, like, Gustave Le Bon, you're not feminized in that ultra sense, because feminism, I've linked feminism with regression. Yeah. And I challenge people to argue that that's not the case. So therefore, the opposite then must be, as you see in the character like Don Juan or whatever, and Howard Rourke, a masculinization. Well, I'm sorry, I can't help that. Giordano Bruno was a masculine guy. William Blake was a masculine guy. Ayn Rand is a masculine woman. It's non-negotiable as far as I'm concerned. And we will give medals to masculine women and masculine men in sports, in this and that, almost in our culture, right? Or like an inventor or what. How come it is then when it becomes philosophical or spiritual, suddenly those words now take on this, people critique them as if they're being monstrous and exaggerated. How come you're rewarding it everywhere where you go? When there's one of your daughters goes and becomes a brilliant piano player, right? Well, whether you realize it or not, that's a masculine act. So going back to the Ayn Rands is so good as a sort of a grounding and an acid test and a way to stay very rooted in simple premises that lead to bigger things. So it doesn't matter to me that she's a materialist. I'm not a materialist, but I don't care that she is, because if you follow materialism through, it'll lead you right back to mysticism, by the way. Some materialists know that, the others will still not concede it. But I'm telling my audience that it bloody well does. So I'm not fussed about that, because I also know that prima materia, right? Nigredo, you've got to keep your feet on the ground if your head is going to be in the stars.
Well, and many of her ideas contradicted the materialist paradigm. Even, like the idea of consciousness being volitional alone is not a materialist idea. It's 100% a mystical idea. So whatever, and when you were saying, Michael, about why in the world of philosophy and religion and all these subjects, people are afraid of the masculinization aspect. And again, we always have to say we're not talking about gender here. We're talking about principles, right? I think the reason is because the priest class for so long has held it in and put it into the overly feminized, unbalanced way of being. So people are used to, oh, well, if I'm going to be spiritual, let me just get into spiritual mode here. And you probably see this all the time, Ryan. Okay, so we just pull out the yoga mats and let's just talk about internal bliss and shutting out the world and, no material possessions. All I need is my frickin' sandals in life, and that's it. And I don't want anything from anybody. And you just go, well, hold on a second. Are you guys going to be the ones that guard the gates from the evil orcs that are at the gate? Like, are you going to be the ones? Because if that's the case, I'll put armor myself and go and defend the village. You know what I mean? Like, so it's like there's extremes, and it can go extreme masculine. I mean, Michael, you did a whole series on the brotherhood of death, talking about when masculinization can go wrong, right? And we know that. But right now, we just so happen to be living in a time where it seems to be like we're under some spell of a dark goddess or something, like you were saying in that program, Michael, where it's gone extreme to one side. Well, and I think that's where all this liberalism and stuff is coming from.
Well, when the roots of consciousness are imbalanced, because of the ancient trauma, things we don't have time to get into, there's a chance that one paradigm that was normative in the will go skewed. For instance, Ryan was talking about the shamans that he works with, and he was even talking about Carlos Castaneda and that tradition. That tradition is well aware of what you just said. They're aware that the primitive tribes that we study, academically, and you look back and there's this jungle group and that jungle group and this guy over there, these little primitive tribes of North America, whatever. What we have not been taught, but what Ashwala de Lubitsch will only be too happy to tell you, is they are not the nascent civilizations from which we've evolved. They themselves are the end of high civilizations that have devolved. That's why they're scratching around in the dirt without a wheel, or all the rest of it. Those tribes and cultures 11,000 years ago and even later, the shaman within them said, I am here to rebuild, to take these people out of the mud. Then you understand religion. Religion is return, right? Yoking back. That we are all devolved. Now, of course, this is another challenging precept, because it means that the myth of progress, and anyone who buys into it, like the modern age thinks of it as more civilized than those primitives, is in a state of absolute social hysteria, social delusion. And there are such things, national fantasies. And the biggest one, Patrick McGowan signed it, tried to teach it in 100 ways to the right brain. The myth of progress, right? With that bicycle, that penny farthing, right? You're not evolved, you're devolved. And what you're talking about then, the compensation, the false masculinity that sees a false femininity, and the false femininity that is based its identity on a false masculinity. What a travesty. What an absolute schizoid mess. And therefore, the shaman, the Saka, the true Arya, are those who really know this and know that civilizations decay. The wisest man is also wise about when his own civilization is going to decay. Ours is already in a state of decay. Of course, based on other things we've been talking about, like returns, there's a chance for evolution out of the wreckage of the old. But the wisest of men, this is in the Upanishads, this is in the Shastras, this is in the Vedas, it's in the Edda, it's in the Celtic and pre-Celtic traditions. Wise is he who knows when the limit of his own civilization has come, knows how to spot it and get the hell out, right? Or to customize his message then to those people who understand something's wrong here, right? Now, that the end of ages can take place, and how then the decay will come, how a deluge, a cataclysm will take place. First of all, it'll be psychic, and we're seeing that the rise of the left, we've said it before, David and I, on so many shows. All of this nonsense that you're seeing with these fruitcakes running wild is the decay of a certain age, in which a certain worldview, and a political milieu, post-war, all of this is all failing. We can't get into it. But we have other podcasts like Give Us Solutions with Michael Black and other people can dip into that. I'll put the links below. But the main thing is to understand that the wisest of men understand that civilizations come and they go. And that ultimately all of our Western civilization, for all its merits and some good stuff, is really an echo. Plato said it this way. Let's turn to philosophy. Anamnesis. It ties in with the Hermetic tradition. The Hermetic tradition takes on board that we're not in any state of progress at all, and that the eternal philosophical questions will always be with us. And they talked about anamnesis, tapping into the ancestral consciousness, right? Would you agree that it is the root of all Hermetic science? Not saying that anything we've learned is new, but how do I tap back into that ancestral worldview where we did have that holism, and that is requiring then purification, which was key to alchemy, and the sensitization. But in our culture, neither of those things can happen. Man, he will die if he tries to purify himself in our cultures today because there's so much toxicity. And if he tries to develop the sensitivity or the sensitization so that he can introspect and listen to the still small voice of the guardian angel or whatever you want to call it, he'll have his teeth kicked in by a world that is full of noise, full of clutter, full of opinions, and full of pseudo-philosophy and religion and all the noise and cacophony. So how does one find the still point, to avoid that? That's the secret of Hermetic science. Wouldn't you agree?
Yeah, I think you just nailed it. You just summed it right up. There's a lot of things that were sort of triggered when you were talking, but the thing that I couldn't let leave my mind while you were talking is that exact concept, that what you just said, back to the shaman or the sages, and my experience with the Lakota people. Because what I would say is, as much time as I've spent around ceremony and participating in ceremony, it's very interesting that the people leading the ceremony have never told me what to do, and they've never told me what's going on. And I sat back. I got this pretty quick because I sort of intuited this before I even participated in it. But after a couple years, I started to realize, oh, there's all these symbols going on. There's circles. There's the 4 directions. There's gates that people enter and leave. There's certain things. There's certain sacred plants, stones. There's smudging. There's feathers. There's wings. There's a tree at the center of all of this, right? There's all these symbols right in your face, right? And no one is telling you what they mean or what they're for or what's going on. And I went like, whoa, I have all these questions, right? What I want to know, right? And I kind of like, in the most respectful way, at the right times, in ceremony, in lodge, when it is okay to speak about these things, I would ask certain questions. And it only took 1 or 2 questions before I realized what was going on. I was like, oh, these people have no interest in initiating me. and they have no interest in initiating anyone. It's you who have to step into that and go, all right, I don't know exactly what's going on, but I feel it. I know it's good. I know it's of the light, and I'm going to raise my level of commitment all on my own. If you don't get that on your own, if you don't have that experience and go, okay, what's the next step for me? Then no one will ever tell you. And I think that's a really beautiful way to do it, because no one is cramming down a dogma into your mind, into your, no one's telling you this is the way it is. This is how it has to be. This is what's supposed to be. Now, don't get me wrong. They have their protocols and they're very strict and they're very sacred. But what I'm trying to say is the difference between our modern culture, in my opinion, and the spiritual path, or the path of selfhood, is there's very few people in the West that actually, first of all, embody it or know it, and then can teach it. Like, you can't find this type of initiation in churches, and I've visited lots of churches. I've tried. So the best way for me to say this is like, okay, when you're ready, you go up on the hill, you go to a homblecha, you go to a vision quest. And what happens up there? Well, I can't actually tell you, because I've only helped people go up. I haven't done it myself, but I've learned a lot in being a part of that tradition. And I go, oh, it's just that one person and creator. That's it. There's no society there. There's no collective there. There's nobody telling you what's going on with you in those moments. You're there for up to 4 days, 4 nights, under the sun, under the moon, under all the stages of the day and of nature. And you're there without water, you're there without food, and you're in a sacred space that's been created for you. And it's just you alone, all one, in what you are, in nature, with the spirit. And
that's what scares the shit out of people.
Yes. And that's
what you need to spur the courage.
So Ayn Rand, in her philosophical way, is saying that, like, it's the individual. It's like all this happens within the individual. And until you realize that and take responsibility for your own thoughts and actions, instead of like try to become a member of the herd or try to blame everything on something outside of you, you haven't really even begun the path.
Wow. Well, first of all, like, time has flown incredible. I'm just looking at the clock. I'm like, oh my God, we have like 2 minutes left. I can't believe it. So Ryan, we absolutely have to have you back. I feel like we're just getting to know you here. So we might have you back a few times, because this has just been incredible. Yeah. We've been able to bring out so many points. Maybe in the last few minutes, could you give people an update on what your next book is and what other projects you've got coming on that you can let people know about?
Yes. First, thank you guys very much. I would love to come back. This is the stuff that I'm genuinely interested in and passionate about. So I would love to come back. My third book I think it should be out by Christmas, and it's a totally different type of book. It's definitely deals with my own experience, but it's about 90% the life story of how a Lakota man named Lee Plentywolf, started out as a young boy and then became devoted to a medicine path, and then just last year became crowned with a full headdress as a member recognized by the tribe as a crowned spiritual leader. And so I worked with him for the last 6 years. We've done ceremony in other countries and a lot of ceremony here in the United States. And he asked me to write a book because he had read my other books, and he thought I could do it because I understood somewhat what's going on in the tradition. I have that philosophical mind. And even though this is not my native tongue or the way I was brought up, I've learned a great deal, and I won't pretend to act like I know everything that goes on in their tradition. It is very sacred, and some of it is very guarded for just reasons. But the book is all about the life of this man and the things that have happened to him and the things that he's done for other people and the effects that this particular way of spirituality really ultimately it builds character. The whole point in this old tradition, I kind of think all real traditions, is to build high character. It's all about the 7 Lakota life principles, which is respect, honor, courage, wisdom, love. It's like walking through life with those things. Very simple, right? But doesn't mean that it's easy. So that book will be out by Christmas.
Oh, perfect.
Well, thanks for your work. I love it. Thanks for the work you do, you know.
Thank you,
Same
guys.
here, yeah. And thanks for sending that book. I'm going to be combing through it, and I greatly appreciate that, Ryan. And so thank you for your contribution. And Michael, fantastic as always. And Michael, you've got a show coming up next week. You alluded to it. You're doing the sort of an ode to some of the greatest females in history that have contributed to building civilization. And then you have some specials coming out on auto rank coming soon. Yes.
Yeah, the files have been sent at part 2, and there'll be a part 3 later. But part 2, which is getting deeper into the work of auto rank, which is kind of unique. People, that's for members. And yes, next week we'll do great women. These are the women who have affected me. There's about 4 or 5 in the list, and I just want to introduce them to our listeners and viewers. Some they may have heard us speak about, and others that they may not have heard of.
That's excellent. I can't wait. Well, thanks to all of our members for tuning in and listening, supporting this show. We've got great content coming your way. We've also got some exciting announcements coming up for the fall, so stay tuned. And we'll catch you guys again for another episode of the Unslaved Podcast next week. Cheers, guys.
I will not make any deals with you. I've resigned. I will not be pushed, filed, stamped, indexed, briefed, debriefed, or numbered. My life is my own.